as follows. Today is really all about like the phenomenon of sound and like our perception of it. So we're not going to talk too much about loudspeakers today because we need to like lay a lot of groundwork for understanding how to talk about them. And so we're going to cover some of the physics and like basic behavior of sound and the sound field. We consider like what the sound is doing in like a space. And then we're going to talk a little bit about human perception of sound and how that plays into like what you need to think about when you're setting up the sound system. And there's a lot to talk about in just those 2 bullet points. And then that'll be it for today. And then tomorrow we'll actually get into talking about loudspeakers, and we're going to talk about their specifications. Jason mentioned that it's actually pretty hard to like discern what makes a good loudspeaker from what's not a good loudspeaker. Like if you're shopping around, or it's all very subjective. Everybody has their own opinion about them, but actually there are specifications that lay out pretty straightforwardly like what you need to be looking for. And in a lot of cases, you can kind of get a pretty good sense for what you're shopping for just by looking at the spec sheet. And then, of course, on top of that, there's certain manufacturers that put a lot more engineering into their loudspeaker, and we're going to talk about what they have done to make them so much better than other ones. And then we're going to talk about, like, so if you have a small space like this, really your best bet is to have just a few, like 2 loudspeakers, because the more you add, the more they kind of interfere with each other. But when you get to a really big dance floor, you kind of can't build a speaker that's loud enough just by itself to cover the entire dance floor. So you need to array them together, and we'll talk about how to build loudspeaker arrays and what to do what's good and what's not so good when you're doing loudspeaker arrays. And then we'll get into talking about tuning the system, and we'll talk about this system processor and all the things it can do, the crossovers, the delays, setting the gain structure, which is like the volume levels all throughout the chain of the different parts of the system, and equalizing it so it sounds really good. We'll kind of go through that process together. And then last, we'll kind of just touch on a couple tips for like if you're in the heat of the party and things go wrong. Like here's the things that tend to go wrong and how to kind of address them. So hopefully with the new sound system, things will go wrong less often. It's not one of the goals, but still things always tend to go wrong. So.
It's almost always put gas in the generator.
Yeah.
Always put heat in the generator.
No, even when you do that, someone comes and turns off the generator and runs off with the key, which is I think what happened last year. There's no way to win. All right, so let's dive in. And feel free to stop me if you have any small questions, but if you have big questions, save them for the end.
You can send out the slides later?
Yeah. All right, so sound is actually our perception of a physical process in the world, and that's the mechanical transduction of a wave through as a pressure displacement traveling through air or water or some medium, right? And so our perception of it is actually quite different than the physical phenomenon. And we're going to be talking about both perception and the phenomenon today, both. But broadly speaking, sound waves have 3 properties that really dictate their behavior. These are the properties that are kind of inherent in all one-dimensional wave kind of phenomenon. They have an amplitude, which is kind of like their intensity or volume. You could think of it that way. They have a wavelength, which is to us the frequency of the sound. And it's also literally the wavelength in like the distance of one entire wave in the space, like in air or water or whatever. And then the phase of the sound is very important as well. That's how much you shift the wave back and forth. So you can be sliding these things past each other, and depending on their relative phases, they're going to actually sound together differently. So sound waves, behave in a pretty intuitive manner when 2 of them interact with each other and cross, or if they come to the same point at the same time, they just add together. And so they're going to either add together like this, where they constructively add together, or they're going to add together destructively if they're out of phase. So you can see on the right side, the volume wave is moving in phase and out of phase with the top wave. And the cancellation can be like complete. It can be totally kind of null it out. So there can be certain places that you can stand in a room where you literally just cannot hear a certain frequency, even though it's blazing at like 4 kilowatts. And it's just that 2 speakers have crossed at that exact point and canceled the waves from those speakers have canceled it out. So. So this is like kind of thinking about the wave as a one-dimensional thing. Let's move quickly into thinking about the wave as it exists in an open space, because sound waves are not one-dimensional. They are in space and time, such in this kind of medium that we will call the sound field. And if you think about it mathematically, it's kind of just like it's a function of both space and time, and then of course it has frequency and phase. Let's see if I can open up. Let's see if this works. Yes, it does. One second. So along with these slides, I'm going to send you guys a link to this website. There's this really cool little WebGL demo where you can play with kind of a ripple tank, basically. Oh, don't do it. Try again. This is what happens kind of in real life. This point here is basically what we would call a point source or a point emitter, and it's like the most idealized like source of the sound. It's like a point in space which is emanating sound in all directions, evenly and equally.
Or it's like a series of pebbles being dropped in water, kind of.
Yeah, actually. Yeah, if you ever drop pebbles in water, that's kind of. Let's go back to
Buddhist meditation.
reset this. Alright, so we can drop a source. What? Alright, so there's our point source. So a point source behaves very well when it's in an infinitely open space. There's nothing to reflect off of, and when there's no other point sources. But as soon as you add a second point source, say like over here, you suddenly start to observe kind of this interesting pattern of interference. And this is really literally what happens in a room with 2 point sources, like 2 speakers, or 2 point sources can even be 2 different drivers in the same speaker. Like all of these loudspeakers have multiple actual speaker cones. And in some frequency ranges, they actually are both firing at the same time, or they're crossed over. And in those places, you have to be really careful to kind of manage this pattern. There's no way around it. But you can engineer your way kind of into having it not be as big a deal, basically. You can engineer this pattern so that these points where there is basically no sound energy, which are these lines here radiating out, those are areas of complete cancellation. You can engineer them to be closer or further apart. So one thing you can do to kind of cause that to happen is you can move the points closer together. And you can see as you do that, you can create a much wider arc between the points of cancellation. And the other thing that is really kind of an important consideration here in how closely those end up being spaced is changing the wavelength of the sound. So if you change it to a lower frequency sound, the fact that they're spaced a little further apart is kind of less of a big deal. But if you have something that's very high frequency, like a tweeter, you can see that it creates a bunch of these kind of null areas. So this is kind of the basic, most important consideration when you start to have multiple sound sources, which you kind of always have to have. All right. So when I send out these slides, each of these pictures actually has a link, a RESTful kind of like web link that when you click on it, it brings up the web page with the interactive version of the picture. So it should be fun to kind of like bookmark and play with in this way. So as I was saying, like when you have 2 point sources, you end up with this complex pattern of interference, and you have these kind of null zones where basically the intensity drops to 0 for that particular frequency. But remember that this is just for one frequency, so it's actually an even more complicated mess in the room. There are high frequencies with lots of null zones and low frequencies with fewer. So it's kind of, you know, it's a very complicated bunch of interference going on at the same time. somebody be willing to maybe run a graphic door? They can probably have to get it. So again, as we were saying, if the point sources are kind of close together, you can spread out those null zones. And a good example of this would be the mid and high range driver on a pair of loudspeakers. So the Mackeys are a good example. You can see the high range driver is actually a cone, and beneath that is kind of a middle sized speaker, beneath that are the bigger ones. The spacing between those are actually kind of relatively close together. And so the arc between the null zones is actually big enough so that it can kind of encompass people's bodies and heads in front of the loudspeaker. And it's engineered that way. They picked the particular frequency to cross over the speaker so that the null zones basically are above and below human beings who are trying to be in front of the speaker. But it means that if you were to turn that speaker on the side, like if you were to hang it up on its side, there would be null zones that might be out here at, let's say, 45 degrees and minus 45 degrees that weren't kind of an issue when you were just standing in front of the loudspeaker, because we never go down or up far enough to kind of get in, kind of out of the null zones. But if it's on its side, suddenly you can walk sideways through the null zones. And so that's actually, for most speakers, you tend to want to have them upright for this reason.
Does that also mean that like these Mackeys are like designed to be at a certain height? Like if you put it at a different height of stand, it's going to mess you up?
Absolutely. So another thing that you can do, if we go back to that little applet. So let me go back to the lower frequency.
With the power strip, Jeremy.
Intermediate frequency. All right, so you saw that like as I dragged this around, it would actually kind of point the null zones up and down. Dragging it up and down is actually the same as delaying it. So if, and actually, I could probably just show that by typing in a little delay here. So as we add some phase offset to the top emitter, what effect that has is it kind of tilts up the entire interference pattern. So when you're setting a delay on a FX processor or in the crossovers, one of the reasons you'll do that is set a very tiny delay between the two drivers in a loudspeaker to kind of direct that pattern of good sound either up or down. Most like studio monitor speakers are designed to be like pointed down about like 10 or 15 degrees, and so you really kind of they're designed for you to have them a little above your head. Most loudspeakers are designed that way too, because you really want to kind of focus the good sound where the people are going to be listening. So does that make sense so far? Cool. All right. All right. And then here's a little diagram kind of explaining what I was just saying. So when you have these two drivers, there's these wavefronts in phase immediately above the speaker, but then there are these places where the wavefronts are maximally out of phase with each other, just because of the kind of the geometry and the distance that it has traveled so far. And that's where those null zones kind of happen. So this is a phenomenon that happens between drivers within a speaker or between separate speakers as well. So when you're in kind of that middle range of frequencies we were looking at before, you're kind of in this place where you can actually space out the null zones a useful amount and kind of spread them around where people might be. When you're at very low frequencies, you need to be careful because like subwoofer frequencies have such long wavelengths and such large null zones that you can like literally walk through like a meter or two of like null space at a certain frequency. And so if you're not careful about how closely together or far apart your subwoofers are, you can create exactly the same phenomenon. And because subwoofers tend to be spaced horizontally, this null pattern is going to play out horizontally in the sound stage and not vertically. So let's see. But for high frequencies, you kind of have a similar problem. You have like so many little null zones. They kind of like just spider out into the space and they're everywhere. But they're so closely spaced actually when you're at the very high frequencies that you actually don't notice them. And instead of perceiving them as null zones as you kind of walk around, your ear just kind of like it hears enough high frequency information that it kind of averages it out, and you don't actually perceive them as null zones. And in fact, they help you to perceive stereo effects, like you can actually perceive the directionality of the sound, because there is a relative phase to the sounds that are arriving in your ears. So at high frequencies, it's mostly not a big deal, unless the tweeters are really close to each other, because then the null zones can kind of spread out a little bit. So that's why, if you look out there, I flipped the JBLs so that their tweeters are right next to each other, because that actually creates the null zones being as wide as possible. But when the tweeters are really far apart, it's just no big deal. Subwoofers, on the other hand.
Wait, it's not a big deal, then why did you do it that way?
Oh no, sorry. For the high frequencies, it's a big deal if they are in an intermediate distance.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah. If they're really close to each other, that's okay. If they're really far apart, it's stereo. It's just kind of in between. You can create like these weird interference patterns that you would actually perceive.
What are the rough distances of media too far apart?
So for the tweeters, you want to be within like a few, like less than 10 centimeters together is what I calculated one time. Far apart is like on the order of like 2 or 3 meters, like the normal distance that you would put some speakers apart. So.
Can you give some like typical threshold frequencies for these sorts of dimensions?
Yeah, I think my memory is like around like 1 kilohertz and higher. It was maybe 2 or 3 kilohertz is kind of where the high frequency regime starts in my mind. But I haven't actually done those calculations in a long time. So, but they are pretty simple calculations. You can just compute.
That seems like rule of thumb is pretty good.
So this is probably a really basic question, but this only happens when you're running the same signal through these multiple points, right? This is not like sound lead issues, like you have different signals that are canceling, or they're canceling at very bad.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So if the loudspeakers are playing, all of this is like visualizing what happens if you were to play a tone, the exact same tone, a single tone through the loudspeakers. So it's kind of like an artificial situation in that respect, because a lot of music is actually panned to the left or to the right speaker, and it's, then you don't tend to have interference patterns that you would notice as much. But a lot of music is actually not panned to the 2 speakers, and so there, a lot of the stuff in the mid-range tends to be centered in the sound, like in the stereo field, like right in front of you. And that's where you would notice a lot of these things, and certain high-frequency sounds are too. People tend to pan their high-frequency sounds to the left and to the right, because you can really perceive the stereo very well there. But it totally matters, because a lot of times it is the same sound that's coming through the 2 speakers. I keep on getting ahead of myself. So again, for really the mid and high frequencies, if things are spaced far enough apart, we really begin to perceive a stereo effect more so than we perceive these null zones, because we're able to hear one louder than the other, because our head actually does attenuate the sound on one side or the other, and so we do. It helps that we can actually perceive the stereo effect. For low frequencies, you're kind of in a different situation, because here the pattern of interference is really literally human scale, and sound actually travels at these frequencies like right through us. And so we don't perceive a stereo image per se, like some people say that they wonder whether there's like a stereo for low frequencies, but my opinion is that like below 100 hertz, you don't really perceive a stereo effect unless it's a really big sound stage. And it sounds better probably for you to just mix the 2 signals down to mono for the subs. But because there's this like fundamental problem, like in this room, putting these 2 subs here and here, and having all these reflections off the walls, means that there are places all over this room that you can stand where there's cancellation effects. And I've noticed them for all sorts of different kinds of music. When you're outside, you kind of have the same problem with the subwoofers. And so what people have done is they've come up with all sorts of really clever ways to kind of put bunches of subwoofers together to kind of avoid these types of effects. And so the key, I guess, maybe we can show this real quick. So we can can create some very low frequency sounds. And move them apart. So when they get far enough apart, you start to see the pattern of null zones that would be like literally out on the dance floor. And when you put the subwoofers closer together, they begin to look much more like a single big point source, which is much more desirable. So the first guideline with subwoofers is to put them next to each other. And very few people do this for some reason, but it's really much better. Having a big stack of subwoofers on the two sides of the dance floor is just inevitably going to create cancellation somewhere in the middle of the dance floor. And so if you can put the subwoofers in a row on like a line in front of the stage, that's a really good configuration. And if you do more fancy things like this, and this is what people do at the very high end of like, setting up big sound systems for stadiums and things like that. They actually put the subwoofers either in this kind of configuration, where they're in a line, but then they go even further and they actually invert the polarity of some of the subwoofers so that they're firing in opposition to the others.
You mean literally like towards the stage? Or?
Yeah, that's right, literally towards the stage. Subwoofers are basically omnidirectional. Like they have cones on one side, but as soon as it comes out of the sound is pushed out of the speaker, it diffracts around the speaker, and it kind of just goes in all directions. Basically, they're completely omnidirectional. But if you start to array them together like this, and you have some of them firing in one direction and some of them firing in the other direction, and you adjust their relative levels just so, and there are various schemes for doing this, you can actually create a super subwoofer that has a pattern of radiation that is mostly forward, and it cancels out in the rear direction. That's called a cardioid array. And someday it would be really fun to try this. We have 4 subwoofers now. We've purchased 2 more, so that's enough to try a simple cardioid. And if we do that right, we could do something like we could have really loud bass going out into the esplanade, and basically it would be quiet in the camp. That would be pretty cool.
So you can be quiet in the camp by facing the speaker towards the camp.
That's right.
Just make sure.
It requires careful delays and all sorts of things like that.
So just to clarify, the direction doesn't matter. It's just that it's offset in space by like the size of the case.
That's right. Yeah. In fact, I think that diagram is simply illustrating that those two are out of phase. They can be pointed the same direction, but they can be like electrically flipped so that they're running out of phase.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So I mean, and this is only the beginning of like fancy things you can do. And you start to just like treat the sound field as a place where you're trying to optimize for like where there are positive constructive interferences and where there are negative destructive interferences. And this is one of the more successful widely used techniques. The drawback to doing this, though, is that you actually expend a lot of power canceling out the sound behind you. So you need a lot more subwoofers and a lot more amplifiers and a lot more electricity to achieve this effect. So your total power that you're radiating forward is not just the sum of all the individual speakers when you do this.
Is there a simple figure of merit, like to say, 10 speakers and you only get, 0.6 of it or something?
That would be my guess of what that figure of merit is, but I don't know it off the top of my head. But I'll totally, at the end of this class, I can share some like textbooks and all sorts of things that talk about these types of configurations. So the other configuration which works quite well is this called an in-fire array, where they leverage the same trick, where you put all the subwoofers together so that they radiate as a single point source. But again, some of the subwoofers are delayed by the distance, behind the other subwoofer.
I'm not sure I understand what's happening there. They're literally sitting one in front of the other.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. So you'll see stadiums where they have set up subwoofers in a row, and then like 5 or 10 feet behind that, they've set up another row of subwoofers, and that's an in-fire array. And those can also create a cardioid pattern.
Are they delayed? Are the front ones delayed? Or?
I believe sometimes they're delayed, and sometimes the distance that they've set them back is the delay, I think. I actually, I've never, I have never built such a thing. So.
Yeah, because if you wanted to add constructively in front, you would think you'd have to get them back in phase.
Yep.
One question about the first one, where is that energy lost to? Because normally when you have cancellation, it's at a point, and then you
Sure.
have
Yeah.
constructive interference at some other point in space.
Yeah, yeah. That's a good question. So I think my impression is you basically think of it as, or my impression of this is that you can have one really loud wave just at a single frequency going off into space. And then if you could somehow have a coincident point source that was exactly at the same point but at a phase, you could create another wave that was perfectly at anti-phase to that.
You have no.
And there would be a lot of energy being expended out into the air, but actually it would be canceled out locally. It wouldn't. It's not like the cancellation would be happening out here. I think the cancellation would happen very close to the 2 point sources, and they would just not radiate anymore. That's my impression of this.
So,
With that,
so further away, you're saying all the energy is still radiating a sound.
well, further away, it never gets further.
it never
away.
gets very.
What's attenuating?
Because one wave is pushing really hard, but then immediately before that wave has any time to propagate anywhere, the other one is like pushing back and restoring it. And this is actually not really physically possible because air is like slightly compressible, and it would be, you know, we create some sort of sound emanating in some way. But
You'd also probably the speaker cones would you'd be putting force back onto the speaker cones.
that's true. It would probably destroy
Singularity.
but the cardioid array, I think probably the sound does propagate a short distance out behind before it encounters its anti-wave, and then that basically halts the pressure wave and sort of stops it in its tracks, is my impression. So the pressure wave only makes
Where's
it
the energy go?
Yeah.
well, there's a lot of energy in one wave, and then it takes a lot of energy to stop it, right? So there's as much energy was put into this one, it takes at least that much energy to then bring it to a resting state again. And that's where the energy goes. So it's like you're doing a lot of work to get nowhere by pushing in both directions at the same time.
Broxton, if you did a frequency sweep from 30 hertz to 100, would this cardioid pattern shape change throughout that spectrum?
That's another good question. I don't know the answer to. I think so. In fact, that's what's being demonstrated here. It's still roughly cardioid, but it starts to develop these like lobes in the back. So it's kind of an imperfect cardioid. Cool. Any other questions about this stuff? Or comments? All right, so there's a lot of other factors. I mean, basically, the interference pattern is just the most kind of basic thing. There's also reflections, which play a huge role in most situations. In all situations, you tend to have the ground, which is a reflector that, in some ways, is a lot like having a mirror surface that just kind of reflects the sound. So sometimes when I have the subwoofers on their side, you get a boost of energy from having the subwoofers close to the ground like that. And it's partly because all that sound energy that would have just like radiated off into space where no one was listening is getting reflected up as though there were mirror image subwoofers beneath the ground. And so you can kind of think of it as having like double the subwoofer if your ground is like perfectly acoustically reflective. So it's just redirecting energy away from where it's just radiating into nothing and towards people. If you think about it, like subwoofers are actually tremendously, ridiculously inefficient radiators because they're radiating all this energy in all directions, and the human being that's listening to the music is like in this tiny little like solid angle, like 100 feet from the speakers. So they're receiving a very small fraction of the total energy. So there are certain subwoofers that actually are horn-loaded subwoofers. They actually have a waveguide that guides the bass energy out through kind of this like horn. I mean, there are horns in all
the
these
bass
speakers.
cannon? Is that what that is?
The bass cannon is directional, so that's also kind of a waveguide. And those are much more efficient loudspeakers. They can achieve the same energy for a lot less power because they don't radiate bass energy in all these other directions that no one is listening. They keep it focused in a direction where it's useful. So horns are typically much more efficient radiators because they focus.
You would, in what case would you, are they more expensive also, or like, why wouldn't you not use such a thing?
We'll talk about horns tomorrow.
Okay.
There are some reasons, and we'll get into talking about horns tomorrow.
Like how does a horn basically plane, and well, you were saying that like sub-frequencies are omnidirectional.
Mhm.
How does it basically plane an omnidirectional wave?
And like corral it in
Yeah.
a certain direction.
Once it emanates from that cone, doesn't it just whoa?
Yeah, so the loudspeaker is literally inside this like really strong box where the exit outlet of the speaker is connected to like a tube which is really reflective, but it's like flaring at just the right speed so that the energy never really exactly reflects back. It always just kind of like it's kind of like guided in slowly until, but by the time it exits the horn, it's like pointed in a certain direction. This is probably one of the most complicated aspects of engineering a good loudspeaker is designing a horn, because that pattern of flares is what determines like how directional the sound will be, and it affects certain frequencies more than certain other frequencies, and so that's a whole art unto itself. And we'll talk about that tomorrow a little bit.
Crazy.
But it's particularly hard to do that with subwoofers, and it's one of the reasons that people have designed and developed horn-loaded subwoofers. Those have become like kind of the industry standard because you can achieve so much more volume with so much less power with them. All right, so reflections, especially also when you're indoors, you have reflections off of walls, and those create all sorts of messes. It's tough to deal with those.
And that's because the reflections basically create virtuals.
Yeah,
Or
more virtual
sources, right?
sources
And then
all over
they're
the
starting
place.
to create the test.
Yeah, exactly. So they just make the interference pattern like chaos, basically. Refraction is when sound waves will hit an edge of an object and then bend around it. This happens much more to low frequencies than to high frequencies. And low frequencies will refract around basically everything, and high frequencies will do very little. So absorption is important for avoiding reflections. You just have materials that kind of absorb sound, or the more humid the air up to a point, the more sound energy will be absorbed in the air. So really dry air tends to propagate the sound further at the same volume, without as much attenuation. And then scattering is where you take the energy, you don't exactly absorb it, you just kind of like randomize it and scatter it in all directions and kind of diffuse it. And certain like listening studios will have acoustic paneling, which is designed to just kind of do this, where it scatters the sound and kind of fuzzes it up. So I also recommend this really fun Ripple Tank app, which you can download for your iPad or for your computer, and it has all sorts of like fancy like scenarios that you can play with fun wave phenomena. And, it's pretty practical for getting an intuitive grasp of this. So between that website I showed you and this, you can do some cool stuff. So, all right. So as Eric alluded to, just thinking about sounds in terms of single frequencies of sounds, it's really not telling the whole story at all, because sounds are a composite of a bunch of different frequencies all at the same time. And a real sound that we encounter in the world is a complex beast, which you can think of as being composed of a bunch of sine waves that are all added together, but the sine waves are all at different frequencies and they each have different phases. And if you're an engineer, you know that what I've just described is actually one of the most like powerful, fundamental sort of theorems of mathematics and physics, and that is this idea that you can take any signal in the time domain, where it's evolving over time, and you can decompose it into its constituent frequencies and describe it as frequencies instead of time. They're complementary and equivalent representations of the same thing. And there's this mathematical transform called the Fourier transform that allows you to do this. And so here we've illustrated a couple time domain things, like if you have a single impulse in time, which is like a instantaneous sound, it actually contains all frequencies. In order to build up that impulse, you'd have to add together all the frequencies in equal amounts. And sort of intermediate, if you have a sound that turns on and turns off like that, it's a weird sound, I'll admit, but it has a frequency representation that looks kind of like that, and a sine wave on the time domain is an impulse in the frequency domain, and so on. We're not going to actually get into Fourier transforms, because that's kind of outside of the scope of what we really need to understand. But this is like the tool that you would use to actually build and design a lot of these things. But the problem with the Fourier transform is that it decomposes a time signal, which is like something that evolves over time, into a single set of frequencies that describe that time series for the entire span of time, which is a cool thing, but it's not how we usually think of music. We think of music as having frequency structure and time structure at the same time. And so a better representation, which is much more intuitive to us, is what our ear does, is to have a mixed time frequency representation, which is to say that you have sounds that evolve over time, but any given moment you can think of like what is the instantaneous frequency content at this moment in time of the current sound that I'm hearing. And it turns out we can actually do this digitally as well, albeit not perfectly. If anybody wants like bonus extra explanation afterwards, I can describe why it's imperfect. But the tool called the spectrogram is giving us this time frequency representation. It's also called the short time Fourier transform because the way that you compute this is literally to take little windows of time and Fourier transform them. Take the next little window, Fourier transform it, just kind of like line them up. So using the spectrogram, this gives us now some great insight into kind of the spectral content of what we're listening to or what we're trying to do. Time is something that we typically experience in a very linear fashion, meaning that we just kind of proceed through time at the same rate all the time. But frequencies are something that we perceive in a logarithmic kind of fashion. And that is to say that a doubling in the frequency is something that we perceive as like a doubling in like the next octave of sound, but then you have to double the frequency again after that to go the next octave of sound. And so doubling in frequency corresponds to something that we perceive to be a linear progression of octaves. So this is like, this is true of almost all of our senses. We tend to experience things logarithmically because it gives us much bigger dynamic range for experiencing phenomena in the world. We can perceive things that are really, really tiny, or really low frequency, or really high frequency, kind of along a more continuous spectrum. So, this is something that is in the presentation, and it's actually kind of useful to refer back to at various points. But basically, subwoofers, mid-range speakers, and horns are the kind of the three types of speaker that you will probably ever encounter in a sound system. And they're good for reproducing different parts of the spectrum. So the spectrum goes from 20 hertz, which is the very lowest frequency that humans can hear, up to about 20 kilohertz, which is about the very highest frequency that we can hear. And everything below 100 hertz is what you tend to reproduce on a subwoofer. From 100 hertz up to 2 or 3.5 kilohertz is considered a mid-range. And then 3.5 kilohertz or higher is the high end. And here you can kind of get a sense for where things fall on the spectrum. And I think the thing that is most important from this diagram to take away for me is that, for one thing, there's this straight line here that says keys and synthesizer. So like that's electronic music. It's like it spans the whole spectrum. It kind of dabbles in the whole area. A lot of music that is not electronic music is really in the mid-range, and so that's where you really want to have like a really like clear speaker with like good articulation and not a lot of interference, because when you have interference patterns, humans are really good at still hearing the sound and like decoding it, but it kind of muddies the experience. It's not very clean, right? So the mid-range is really important. I have this other diagram, which is actually kind of more appropriate for this crowd. This is something of writing it out for electronic musicians. Again, you have the subs, the mids, and the tops, and you can kind of get a sense for. I like down at the bottom they have the weight is in the subs. The part of the sound that people would describe as the warmth is in the frequency range from about 250 to 400 hertz. The knocking and the definition, or the bite, that's in the mid-range from 1 to 2 kilohertz, 600 up and whatnot. And then for the parts of the sound that people typically describe as clarity and sparkle and things like that, that sound system has such clarity. That's probably a sound system that has really good tops and really good high frequencies.
What are the bands that are missing description?
I don't know. I guess these people thought they were less important. I don't think they're necessarily less important. It's really very track dependent. And you really, if you can, just want to have the whole. I mean, the one reason I enjoy doing this with electronic music is Anselm also has developed this idea, which I like a lot, which is that people have developed instruments like the drums or the piano or the violin for playing certain types of sounds and performing them. And it's always a little weird to him, and frankly to me as well, to come and listen to a reproduced recording of someone playing one of those instruments on a loudspeaker system. Because that acoustically is not going to be able to achieve the same effect as you would have listening to one of those instruments. But electronic music is music that was designed from the very beginning to be played on a loudspeaker system. And in a way, the loudspeaker system is its instrument. And it's one of the most fantastically well-engineered instruments ever made because it's so finely crafted in the engineering sense that it can produce almost the entire audible spectrum equally well. And with incredible loudness and impact and warmth and all these things. So electronic music, Anselm calls speaker music, because it's basically music that you play on speakers. So
I wonder if as electronic music progresses, then basically in its infancy still, if we just won't hear those natural sounds anymore ever.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think people will always play their instruments for sure, but yeah. It seems like a lot of the loud music that you hear on big sound systems is pretty electronic-ified nowadays.
I thought electronic music was headphones.
Yeah, well, it's also that, actually. Headphones are great, too. That's a class that Jeremy should teach. All right, so the perception of frequency is a quality that we call pitch. The human range of hearing is from about 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, and we perceive all those pitches logarithmically, as I was saying. And each frequency doubling, again, is what we would call an octave in music. So let's switch now away from frequency and talk about a different characteristic of sound, which is very important to us, people on the dance floor, which is loudness. How loud does it get? How do we perceive it? So loudness is a very important thing, especially, I'd say today this is the most important thing we'll talk about for people who might operate the sound system. Because a lot of considerations go into it, and there's a lot of effects that influence how people perceive how loud it is. And so we're going to go through talking about loudness in terms of the amplification of the sound through the electronics. And then at a certain point, it goes through the speaker, and it goes from being an electronic waveform to being a pressure wave. And at that point, it goes through the air, and it hits our ears, and then we perceive it, and then our ear and brain process it, and then we assign it this quality, which we call loudness. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on in that sort of chain of things. So a very brief digression to talk about an important concept that is the decibel. So our perception of loudness is also logarithmic. Anything that is twice as loud to us is actually 10 times as much acoustic energy landing on our ears. Anything that is then, again, twice as loud again, past that, so now 4 times as loud as the original sound, is actually 100 times more acoustic energy, and so on. So 8 times as loud is actually 1,000 times as much acoustic energy. So you can see how this quickly gets out of control and why loud sounds can damage our ears, because the amount of actual energy being deposited on our eardrums is being increased by orders of magnitude when we just think it's twice as loud. So to go now twice as loud again beyond this would very quickly get us to the point where we could actually damage our hearing. So because of the fact that we perceive loudness in this way, where it's logarithmic, we've developed a scale which is logarithmic as well, and that's the decibel scale. And the decibel scale is basically a way of saying how many orders of magnitude have we gone relative to reference value from the very beginning, like the reference value is kind of, in the case of dB SPL, which is sound pressure level, it's like the quietest sound that most humans perceive. And so every time you go up 10 dB in this scale from the quietest sound that we can perceive, we perceive it as being twice as loud, and that's 10 times as much acoustic energy. We use this scale because it's convenient and it matches our perceptual experience. It kind of turns things in this world of describing pressure waves and voltages and things into the same type of scale as our perception. So, and then here we have, just as an example, to give you some like benchmark points, like a conversation in 60 to 70 dB. If you're driving in a noisy car, it's like 85, 80 dB or something like that. Once you're in the 90 dB, that's like loud music, like that you might listen to in your bedroom or something like that. And then when you're 100 dB or above, you're in like the club or on the dance floor or something like that. So 100 dB is a good number to just bear in mind as like that's like a loud sound. Not too loud, but not too quiet.
Start putting in your earplugs level.
Yeah, around there would be a good time. And we'll talk about that too, actually, in just a moment. And then it goes up from there. Like, you're only at that point 3 orders of magnitude away from like a jet engine or like a gun or the other really, really loud sounds that do damage our hearing like instantaneously. So I really won't cover much on this slide except to say that because we deal with all sorts of different things here, we're talking sometimes about voltages, sometimes we're talking about amplifier power, sometimes we're talking about the pressure in the atmosphere, and sometimes we're talking about like the acoustic power, which is kind of the intensity of that pressure. There are a number of different decibel scales that are for those different situations. So when you're looking at mixers, you'll see the dBu, because that's the voltage decibel scale. For amplifiers, you'll see dBm. For pressure, and you'll see dB SPL, and sometimes you'll see dB SWL, which is like acoustic pressure in the atmosphere. The most important thing to realize about all these is that they're all kind of compatible with each other, and that a 10 dB increase in any one of these, any part of the system, is equivalent. It would cause us to think it was twice as loud by the time it got to our ears. So it doesn't matter, like whether it's decibels here or there, it's the same. So let's talk about the kind of practical things here. So when you are at a mixer, a good mixer should have this one doesn't, but a good mixer should have like a scale of decibels right there on the mixer for you. And there are 3 numbers that you should memorize, basically. We've already said that 10 dB is twice as loud and 10x acoustic power. Another one that's very good is 3 dB, which is twice the acoustic power, and it's 1.23 times as loud. It's not much louder. And the other one that's good to remember is 6 dB, which is 4 times the acoustic power and only about 1.5 times as loud. Some implications of this that are good to think about is that a 1 to 2 dB increase is like almost imperceptible to people. People can't really gauge loudness very well because there's so much going on in music. And so 3 dB is about where you start to actually notice it. Tomorrow when we're setting like equalizers and things like that, and we're looking at how loud various frequencies are compared to others, it'll all be on this decibel scale. And if it's within 3 dB, it's like, it's good. It's already pretty good. So the other thing that is good to think about here is that doubling the amplifier power doesn't actually make it twice as loud. It just makes it 1.23 times as loud to us. So going from an amplifier that costs like $1,000 to one that costs like $6,000 is 1.23 times as much power. So you kind of reach this point of diminishing returns pretty quick once you're up to like a kilowatt or 2 kilowatts or 3 kilowatts.
Money is also on a lot of scale, I guess.
Yeah. So anyway, that's a thing to consider as well. Like, a 1,000 watt amplifier is pretty powerful. A 4,000 watt amplifier, that's like quite a bit more powerful, but then a 6,000 watt amplifier is not that much more powerful than the 4,000 watt one. All right, so let's talk about loudnesses. Like once you're through this part of the system and you've gone out of the speakers into the air, let's just cover one important concept, which is that sound attenuates over distance. And so, it comes out of the loudspeaker very loud. but it quickly spreads out in space. Again, you can think of loudspeakers as point sources, and the best way to think about them is point sources that have been like kind of truncated off on the side so that they kind of create this like solid angle in space, because they don't radiate in all directions in most cases unless they're a subwoofer. And so for the most part, you're dealing with like this cone of sound that's going on. But it is spreading out in this way such that the sound intensity decreases in kind of inversely proportional to the distance that it's traveling. And it's an inverse law, just like a number of other chemical phenomena. So the upshot of this is that as you double the distance, you're decreasing 6 dB, which is that 1.5 times as loud kind of sound. So every time you get twice as far away from the speaker stacks, it's 1 over 1.5 times as loud. And so a really good way to not destroy your ears at Burning Man is to like just step away from the sound system. Like, all the people are dancing up in the front, and I can never understand. It's like really bad for their ears, and it's really crowded. It sounds better back here anyway. So take a step back. Save your ears those 6 dB. And then, so let's now talk about what happens when it gets to your ears, which is kind of the final step. So humans don't perceive all frequencies equally well for the same amount of power that is being received by the ear. And so over the years, we've had like psychoacoustic measurements, basically, of what we call the equal loudness contours or equal loudness curves. And these are basically curves that say, each of these curves say basically that, let's take this one for example, that at 20 hertz or 100 hertz, for you to hear a 100 hertz sound that's as loud as that 20 hertz sound, the 20 hertz sound has to be a much higher sound pressure level, like another 20 dB higher sound pressure level for it to sound as loud to you. And what's also strange is that these different curves, they represent different kind of loudness regimes. So down here, 0 represents like the threshold of human hearing. 40 or 50 or 60, that's like a quiet conversation. So when you're talking at this level, or when you're playing music in your bedroom at kind of a quiet level, have you ever noticed that there's no, like you can't hear the bass as well when it's kind of turned down? It doesn't really, you don't notice as much. It's because at a lower kind of overall level of loudness, you're less tuned into the bass. Like your senses are not going to, your ability to sense the bass is less, relatively speaking, than if it's really loud. When you get up to like really loud sound systems, the bass comes through because you can hear it better relative to the other frequencies. Does anybody remember like the old like Sony Discman? It had a boost switch.
Yeah.
That was because of this phenomenon. It was so that when you were playing music at a lower volume level, it would artificially boost the lows and the highs, so that you would feel like you were listening to something that sounded like it was on a bigger sound system.
That's basically equalizer.
Yeah, that's a simple equalizer trick. Yeah, and so this is actually really important because if you're a DJ or a producer and you're mastering your tracks, you need to master your tracks at the volume level that you want to be, listening to them at, because you're, listening to your track on some like really nice like studio monitor system, and they're like flat frequency response, and your perception of loudness is like what you're basing like the mix on, right? So if you do the mix at like kind of a low, like kind of pleasant listening level, and it sounds great to you at that level, you've brought up the lows and it sounds like it's all well balanced, and then like someone goes and DJs your track on like a big sound system. Have you guys ever noticed like on a big sound system when people's tracks just sound like boomy and like really loud and like just poorly defined? That's probably what has happened, is that they've mastered them in the wrong loudness regime. So you should really be, like, if you can, mastering tracks at like 90 to 100 dB, because that's kind of close to where, that's kind of in between like really big sound system and like smaller sound system.
A lot of folks are actually mastering separate mixes to play live and to listen to on
Yeah.
CD or anything.
That's like the ultimate good thing to do. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is what makes a difference, honestly. Like for some of the people who sound really good on those sound systems, like Tipper or somebody like that, I think he is fully aware of this phenomenon and is like leveraging it in his mix. So.
And it's more fun to master really loud.
Oh, it's such a dilemma. The ears can only take so much of it, but yeah. So you can think of the space between the kind of the threshold of feeling, which is not where you want to be, and the threshold of hearing, which is where you can't hear anything, as the auditory area. And you can see this is really the range of human hearing. It takes into account both frequency and loudness.
Why does the lowest have a really high threshold of feeling? But I feel like the low is what I'm more likely to hear, like to feel.
Oh, well, I guess the threshold of feeling is like feeling pain in your ears.
Not like my back is vibrating something.
You can accommodate infinite bass.
That's right. That is the threshold of pain.
Yeah. I think that is what and normal speech falls in that sort of little area there, and music falls in a larger area. Really, our kind of music is actually in an even larger kind of area. So that's just good to consider. And then kind of the last thing I'll talk about today, and we can open up the floor to questions, is a little bit about measuring noise exposure. And this is really the important take-home message of this section, which is that if you set up a sound system, I feel like it is your job to make sure that you don't damage people's hearing. There are many people at Burning Man who do not do a good job at this, and there are sound systems out there, most of them, that are turned up so loud that people can and do get hearing damage all the time. It's just like ridiculous how loud they are. So there are two things that you have in your bag of tricks to kind of prevent this from happening. One of them that we'll talk about tomorrow is limiters that basically are just sitting there as like protection, backup, in case there's a transient that goes through the system. Like if someone plugs in a cable without turning it down, or if they drop a microphone, or if there's feedback even. This is just like the backup protection that protects both the speakers and people's ears from like total catastrophe. And we'll talk about how to set those correctly tomorrow. The other thing that you should be doing, I think, is actually measuring the sound pressure level. And there's great iPhone apps that do this. The iPhone actually has a very relatively accurate microphone. And people have calibrated. They're also pretty consistent, and everyone has the same iPhone. So people have calibrated the sound pressure level for the microphone. And there are a bunch of really great sound meters on the App Store. And it's a good idea to walk around and figure out how loud it is, because your perception of loudness also is one of many senses that you have that will actually habituate and over time. And so it may be really loud, and after a while you don't really think it's that loud. And then you turn it down, and for a short time you think it's too quiet, but then it sounds fine again. And that's like a...
What's the response time?
For me, it's like on the order of like 30 seconds to a minute, like I feel like this effect kind of plays out. And so what will happen is like a DJ or a sound person will like turn up the sound system more because they want to like bring out that like really awesome part of the track. But then after just a second, they kind of like, it doesn't sound like it's as loud to them.
3 or 4 tracks later.
And then like before you know it, the lights are like a DJ or two later, they're just like all the way in the red, and the sound system is literally 20 dB louder than it was like an hour ago. And it doesn't, like, everyone's still dancing and having a good time, but their ears are being damaged, and they don't realize it really. And you don't really feel hearing damage happening, it's just happening, and it's not good. So anyway, some rough guidelines, I think, are this. 90 to 100 dB is like loud. It's like very satisfyingly loud to me, at least. Where I think, especially at the early or late part of the night, where there aren't a lot of bodies on the dance floor, and the sound is just kind of open and free, that's like a good sound pressure level to be at. At the peak of the party, I guess 100 to 110 dB is pretty good. And these are averages also, so realize that, like, whenever there's like a hi-hat or like, a stab or something like that, it goes up to 130 dB, like 120 dB. It's just that you want to leave some headroom for that to happen. Otherwise, you start to, encounter the limiter or the limit of what the speakers can do.
And I assume you're talking in sort of like the middle of the dance floor where most people are, because
exactly. So like I would say like 10 or 15 feet away from the speakers is like a good place for it to be 90 dB or 100 dB. That's kind of my feeling. And if people are creeping up the volume, you just have to be, good about bringing it back and just tell them, you know, especially the DJs, like, they can't hear how it sounds out on the dance floor. So you just should make it not their job to take care of that. Like, your job is to make it sound good out there, their job is to make it sound good up in the booth, and the two are somewhat disconnected. So, and then the last thing we'll say about this is that this is what OSHA, and there's this other standard called NEOSH, say about hearing damage. That's like an occupational health and safety kind of a thing. We are routinely violating these in egregious sort of ways. If you look, like 100 dB is what they say is like it's like a safe level of exposure. You know, people at Burning Man are like at 115 dB for like 8 hours. That's like yeah, exactly. So just this gives you a sense for like what is considered safe is like already kind of below where we would be normally operating at. So
Is safe, is that equivalent to no damage?
Safe actually in these cases is equivalent to an acceptable rate of damage. So like less than like 1 or 2% of people having some sort of hearing problem.
Equivalent to just getting older itself?
Yeah.
So this is also like for in a professional setting where you're exposed to this on a daily basis or something.
That's right. Yeah, that is true. So there is that difference. Yeah, there is unfortunately no standard for dance music occasional exposure of 8 hours at a time.
But if you're like working in a club and you're there every night,
Yeah.
Regardless of,
Yeah.
Which is why you keep turning it up.
I've got an audiologist appointment on Wednesday. It's fine, yeah.
Half the reasons the system's so really crap is because the sound engineers work there all the time.
Yeah, and they can't hear.
And they can't hear anymore. And when they drink, they can't hear anymore.
Unfortunately, very true. So I'll close actually speaking to just by saying that everybody who spends any amount of time around the sound system, like especially us who probably would be operating a sound system for many hours in a stretch, should have some really good earplugs. And there are many types of earplugs to choose from, but from $10 earplugs that I think you guys all kind of know and love, or you can get custom molded ones, which honestly I would ask your audiologist to just get you some custom molded ones. They're like $150, and they actually have more or less the flattest frequency response of any of the earplugs I'm aware of. And then they have recently come out now with active earplugs, which are basically hearing aids, but they're designed to kind of attenuate the sound. Well, they have like little transducers in them, so they bring the high frequency back up a little bit by actually playing some frequencies into your ears. But they're a bit more expensive.
Have you tried them?
I have a pair. Yeah, they're better than the $10 ones. I can say that. I think I don't know about the $150 ones, but I like them a lot. The drawbacks to them is that they are not designed to be around 110 or 120 decibels, and so the microphones actually saturate, and it's kind of, you can hear that. But when that happens, you know that like you're in some really loud music, and it's probably good that you have them in. So. And they are nice. They have a little switch. You can actually decrease the volume more or less, and they kick in more as it gets louder. So when you're just walking around, like behind the speakers, it actually restores it basically at normal hearing level. So it's really nice. You can just talk to people.
it's a limiter for your head.
What's that? Yeah, it's a limiter for your head. So in my opinion, $300 is very worth it. They're not perfect, but they're pretty good. Anyway, so that concludes tonight's sound session. Tomorrow we're going to talk about loudspeakers and get into the nuts and bolts of actually tuning the system. So,
Let's just do it tonight.
yeah,
Crank it out.
I don't have it actually ready.
Truth comes out.
That's right. So it's just in time. Anyway, but thank you guys for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
And for anyone who wants to stick around, I'm about to go sorting through a bunch of cables and getting the sound system ready for burning.
Now I see why you're doing it.
I know how to get them here.
That's right.
Yeah.
But you don't have